My guest today is comedian and writer David Baddiel. In addition to performing stand-up comedy, David is also a screenwriter and author. He's written several children's books and also co-wrote the song Three Lions, often described as England's de facto football anthem. In 2021, David released his latest book, Jews Don't Count, which explores why anti-Semitism is often an overlooked racism within progressive circles. I want to talk to you today about Jews Don't Count. First off, how would you describe Jews Don't Count and what made you write it?
Well, it's two different things. I'll start with what made me write it, which is I was offered something by the Times Literary Supplement, who were, at that point in time, about 2 years ago, they were talking about doing a run of essay books. Books that would be in the tradition of kind of the sort of thing that George Orwell used to write, which are kind of short, polemical, pamphleteering kind of books about a present contemporary subject. When I was first offered it, they were kind of literary, but I said, can I write about this? And that takes me on to your second question, which is I've been talking for a while on Twitter, in some newspaper articles, just in my life, about what the book is about, which is the kind of exclusion, the missing out of, the ignoring of Jews, Jewish identity, Jewish concern, things that might cause Jewish offence, within a culture that is increasingly hyper aware of those things with other minorities. So it's a book that isn't really about traditional anti-Semitism, if you consider traditional anti-Semitism to be, you know, the far right and neo-Nazis and whatever, people who directly say we hate Jews and think Jews are, as Mel Gibson said, responsible for all the world's evil. That's not the kind of person that the book is aimed at or talking about, even though their presence in culture is very important, because that is what progressives and the left in the book is aimed at, a kind of ignoring, is the resurgent power of those people and that thing. But anyway, within a growing culture that really got turbocharged once social media took hold of us, of what you might call trigger offense about identity, a very, very hyper, you know, kind of everything that might possibly concern or be of concern, not just to the minority concerned, but to allies of that minority. So often what we're talking about here is a kind of, you know, maybe straight, white, progressive who's looking around saying, I have to be concerned about black people, I have to be concerned about gay people, I have to be concerned about trans people, or whatever it might be. Jews were not in that conversation. And so the book explores why that, well, it shows some examples of that, and it asks, why is that?
You actually begin Jews Don't Count by highlighting anti-Semitism in art and literature and in poetry, and this anti-Semitism that's been overlooked or dismissed or even accepted. And at one point you actually talk about this 3-hour lunch you had where you debated about whether T.S. Eliot's poetry was good enough to overlook his anti-Semitism. Well,
with Anthony Julius, I should say.
Yes.
So if anyone doesn't know, I mean, probably on this podcast people do know, but Anthony Julius is a very eminent lawyer, but also a man who has written extensively about anti-Semitism and wrote a book called T.S. Eliot, Anti-Semitism in Literary Form. And, well, so what exactly? So the reason there's literary examples to begin with in art and poetry is probably because the book was written for the TLS. So I begin with stuff that feels sort of relevant to that, I guess. It then sort of moves away from that, although there's a lot about drama and film and TV throughout the book, because that's kind of my background, I guess. But anyway, to use the actual example I'm talking about is, and this is one of about 12 examples that I start the book with, is that in 2017, I think it was, on New Year's Day, Radio 4, which is probably, so to be clear, what I'm talking about here is a progressive agenda, but it's not just a sort of far left agenda. It's a sort of cultural agenda about offensiveness and identity and representation and inclusion that I think spreads far and wide. And you can see that in the BBC. You know, the BBC is basically a progressive organisation. And in 2017, on New Year's Day, they had Jeremy Irons reading all of T.S. Eliot's poetry throughout the day. And I like T.S. Eliot. I think he's a very great poet and all the rest of it. So I thought I'd listen to this, but I was thinking, what are they going to do about the anti-Semitism, and specifically the line in Bleistein with a Baedeker, which is the rats are underneath the piles, the Jew is underneath the lot. There's other examples, but that's probably the most extreme one of just straightforwardly, you know, ultra negative portrayal of Jews. And they've got on Anthony to sort of, you know, kind of explain and contextualize this. And Anthony did a good job of that and all the rest of it. But my central point was not, even though I put in the stuff about going for lunch with Anthony as a kind of light relief, but my central point is context now within the culture that I'm talking about, the hyper-aware, hyper-sensitive identity politics, is kind of irrelevant most of the time. You know, like I personally believe that Danny Baker is totally not a racist, but that context was not important when he did that thing, and people just said, you know, it's what it's the ears of the minority that count, not the intention. You know, right? Impact is more important than intent. Yeah, but nonetheless, this is what happened. The rats are underneath the pile, the Jews underneath the lot is intoned in a rather dignified way by Jeremy Irons, and my point is, this just wouldn't have happened with another minority, and they wouldn't have got someone on to exculpate it or whatever. The BBC just would not have read out that line of poetry on a celebratory day, on New Year's Day, as regards any other minority. Now, things might have shifted since 2017 because things are shifting very fast on this. Yeah, but it's still pretty recent.
Yeah, well, you said you like T.S. Eliot. How much does anti-Semitism, even if it's overt or not overt, how much does that taint work for you, like art for you? Are you still able to enjoy it, or?
Yeah. Well, this is a different issue, isn't it? And a very, also a very present issue, which is how you think about artists and great artists who might have had views which now we would consider to be, not just reprehensible, but actively dangerous. I would say T.S. Eliot's views are actively dangerous, and Roald Dahl's, for another one. T.S. Eliot was part of a context in the 1930s of intellectuals who were essentially pro-Hitler, or certainly thought of Jews as these rootless cosmopolitans who were undermining the national character of a number of European nations, and that's what that line of poetry is about. And Roald Dahl said something in a New Statesman interview in 1981, essentially implying that Jews kind of brought the Holocaust on themselves. And these are very bad and very dangerous opinions. It doesn't make Roald Dahl not a great children's writer, and it doesn't make T.S. Eliot not a great poet. I think it's more to do with the veneration. So I'm still able to read any poetry by T.S. Eliot. I think it's great poetry. The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock is a great poet. It's when you have, Roald Dahl's possibly a better example, because Roald Dahl is so cuddly and so much part of a sort of general sense of we all love Roald Dahl and his characters. There's a Roald Dahl Day. Yeah. And that's the thing. I think I said once, I think Roald Dahl is a great children's writer, but I won't be celebrating Roald Dahl Day, which is a sort of wider sort of acclamation of Roald Dahl than just, he wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So I try and separate it in that way, I guess.
Yeah. Well, so you're also an avid football fan, and you write in the book about how you and your brother went to Chelsea games for many years, and in one incident... Still do?
No, we didn't. Of course, yeah.
In one incident in 2008, you talk about how this fan behind you started chanting F the effing Yids, which then became F the effing Jews.
Yeah.
Do you...
Are you deliberately not swearing?
I am.
Okay, fine.
If you want to swear, that's fine, but we will have to bleep it out.
Very unusual for me not to swear.
Go for no. I don't want to censor you at all. You do you.
Okay, fine.
Absolutely, you do you.
Yeah, that happened. It's interesting because I did write about that at the time. Me and my brother ended up doing a film called The Y Word, where we had big footballers, Frank Lampard and Gary Lineker, all talking about this thing, which some of your listeners will be aware of and others won't, which is that because Tottenham are associated in a racist way with Jews, it's a racist association because they're fairly near, that club is fairly near Stamford Hill, where there's a lot of Orthodox Jews, and so they got known as the Jewish club. This happens, by the way, elsewhere. Ajax in Holland are known in the same way. Various other clubs in Germany. If a club wants to be vilified by other fans, they get called the Jewish club. This led to Tottenham fans, in their own minds, and this is where the complexity is, owning this identity and calling themselves the Y Words and the Y Word Army and all that kind of stuff. And the problem with that, apart from the fact that most of them are not Jewish, right? This is an important thing about Tottenham fans, right? When people say, as they did at the time, but it's all right for Tottenham fans to call themselves Y Words, it should be clear that they're not Jews doing that. There might be a few Jews, but it'll be mainly non-Jews who have made that decision, which is not a decision. It's not theirs to make. Yeah. That is not a non-Jews decision to make. But that aside, the other problem is that other clubs, Chelsea, Arsenal, Millwall, West Ham, whatever, they use that identity against Tottenham. And that involves very extreme anti-Semitism, Auschwitz chants, hissing to simulate gas chambers and stuff like that. And in that particular case, there was a guy just shouting, I'm going to say it, fuck the fucking Jews, over and over again, sort of directed at me and my brother, actually, because by this time I'm well known. I'm well known as a football fan and well known as a Jewish person. So it's clearly directed at me and my brother. And the key element of it, which I talk about in the book, is that by 2008, racism in football was an absolute no-no. It's obviously more so now, but really 2008, we're not talking about the 1970s here. We're talking about a game in which in the programme it will say anyone guilty of any racist chanting will be banned for life.
Yeah.
So this goes on for some time and no steward does anything. No one from the club intervenes. It's really difficult for me and my brother when we decide to bring it to the attention of the authorities to get any interest in it whatsoever. Quite difficult to get kick racism out of football to be interested in making a film about it.
Yeah.
And this is all because of Jews not counting.
Yeah, it's interesting because you may have seen recently there was this viral video where some West Ham supporters were on a plane. You saw it. They were chanting. We're
running around Tottenham with our willies hanging out, singing "We've got foreskins, haven't you?" That's what they were chanting.
Right, and it wasn't at. It didn't look like it was at a football fan. It was at an Orthodox Jewish man.
No, it was an Orthodox Jewish man, on a plane. Yeah, that's one of the things about the Y word, which is that originally when I brought it up and brought it a bit into public consciousness, you'd get people saying, no, they don't mean Jews, they just mean Spurs fans. But as I say, this thing that happened to me and my brother, who are Chelsea fans, having someone shouting "fuck the fucking yids" at us, that means Jews. Yeah. That happened to that man, it clearly means Jews. And by the way, I regularly at Chelsea had people chanting "Yiddo" at me, with people knowing that I'm there as a Chelsea fan, but they also know that I'm Jewish. It blurs. Of course it blurs. Like the very notion that within the discourse of like a football ground and football fans, you can keep that boundaried as like, oh, no, it's just an inter-club banter rivalry. It's clearly not. It's clearly, and it's very complex even within that, because you think like, okay, that makes it all right for them to chant anti-Jewish slogans and anti-Jewish stuff at Tottenham because they imagine them as a Jewish club, even if they're not. That's the point is, as I've said before, what I have to do in Jews Don't Count quite a lot, just to make it obvious, and this is one of the things about Jews not counting, is sometimes you have to transpose what's happening to another minority and imagine it's that to bring home what you're talking about. If there had been a club in a black area, say in Brixton, that became known by racists as the N-word club and whatever, and that club, which was mainly white, right, a mainly white fan base, had decided to own that and call themselves the N-word army and all that kind of stuff, that club would be shut down tomorrow. It wouldn't exist, right? Or the fans would be shut down. They would be stopped from doing that. The club would be fined, blah, blah, blah. There would be an enormous outcry. And the difference is the point. Yeah,
there's clearly still an abhorrent amount of anti-Semitism in football. Do you think it's gotten better since that incident you wrote about in 2008 at all?
A little bit. It's got Chelsea, it's got better. You don't hear as much anti-Semitic chanting at Chelsea. You don't hear as much of the Y word chant. You'd certainly still hear it. Yeah. And you certainly still hear associated stuff. The club itself has made a lot of quite big efforts. I think that's to do with Roman Abramovich, who's Jewish, coming, and Bruce Buck, who is the chairman of the club, is also Jewish. And me and my brother have done various things. We did this film, The Y Word, but we've also done various evenings, initiatives, and whatever. So I think there's a higher awareness. I would say there is less back chanting about Jews from fans who are not Spurs fans. What hasn't happened is Spurs have never dealt with it. Spurs have never dealt with it. Like Daniel Levy, who is Jewish, and other. I believe until very recently you could get a Y word shirt, at Spurs. I don't know if you still can, but you certainly used to be able to. And so this notion that their ownership of it is kind of positive is what's wrong. And it's really complicated. I remember when it was first going off, and I got a lot of trolling for when we first started doing this. And I remember one Spurs fan saying to me, "It's our word now." And that's an interesting thing, isn't it? This notion that a hate word for Jews, a word that was scrawled on the doors of Jews in the East End by Oswald Mosley's black shirts, and has a long history. It should be up to Jews whether that word is reclaimable. But there's a sort of dismissal of that.
Yeah.
It's like, no, we're Spurs fans, we own it now. And that would, again, never happen to any other minority.
Yeah. Well, the phrase "Jews don't count," I mean, it's I don't know if you're aware, it's since become this sort of hashtag on Twitter that's used to highlight instances where concerns of Jews have been left out or ignored. Is it weird to know that you've sort of coined this new phrase? Like, how does that feel?
No, that's good. That's good. And I can tell you something about that, which is kind of annoying. Good, but annoying, which is that the book's just come out in Germany. And I went to Berlin to publicise it, where it got a lot of attention. And I was in a lot of big German newspapers and whatever. It was really great. And I love the German publishers. However, they, who are not Jewish, said to me, "We don't think we can call it Jews Don't Count," which in German is Juden zählen nicht. What they actually said was, in an email, they said, "With our history, I don't think we can call it that." And I was tempted to troll them and say, "What history? What are you talking about?" But I didn't do that. But loads of German journalists, when I did the interview, said, "Why have you changed the name? The name is great."
Wow.
Sorry, it's been changed to "und die Juden" in Germany. It just means "and the Jews?" ? Which always struck me as a bit creepy anyway. It sounds like the sort of thing that in a 1950s film a Nazi would say to the Führer at the end of a meeting. But they said, people will be too offended, and they might take it literally, which is a very German fear. That they won't understand that the book is obviously not saying this is okay. So what I pointed out to them, which they sort of have accepted now, but I don't think I'm going to change the title, is the problem with "Und die Juden" is it has no hashtag power. That's the problem. If I'd called the book "and the Jews?" in English, I promise you there would be no hashtags like on Twitter.
Right.
Jews don't count, which runs the risk of someone not understanding it. I had a few people in Britain saying, "Oh, I wouldn't want to read this book on a bus in case someone thought it was a kind of Nazi manual." Right?
Yeah.
It runs that risk, but most people obviously get it straight away. And the fact is, it's so common, what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It's so prevalent. Obviously, you'll know this. I don't know when this goes out, but the Herschel Fink Royal Court thing has just happened. Yeah. And to be honest with you, it's a brilliant example. I mean, sad, but brilliant example of what we're talking about. Because, as I said at the start, I'm talking about a world in which there is hyper-awareness of potential offence against minorities. By the way, not just racial minorities, not just ethnic minorities, hyper-offence against gender minorities, disabled people, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
All minorities are talked about in this world. And the world could not be more centred at the Royal Court in London. That is, I would say, probably about as woke a space as you'll find in the UK, where they develop new plays for the Royal Court.
Yeah.
And that was where they somehow managed not to spot that calling an unscrupulous billionaire character Herschel Fink might have an issue for Jews. It's sort of unbelievable.
It is. And the interesting thing is, so they released two statements. And the first statement, which was on Twitter, they apologized for using an anti-Semitic name. And someone had to point out that the name is not, and Herschel Fink is not an anti-Semitic name. It was the fact that you attributed it to a billionaire from Silicon Valley. Yeah. I'm just not sure they really understood at first.
I don't know if they understood. I mean, I was on the Today programme yesterday talking about it, and there was one moment where I realised afterwards I should have said something to sort of tie it together, although people I think probably understood anyway. But Martha Carney, who was interviewing me, said, "But why does this happen? Why is anti-Semitism invisible to these people?" And I said something which is in the book, but is just the sort of like starting point, really, which is that the association of Jews with power and privilege and money and all that stuff means that somehow or other, and that's a myth, those are racist myths about Jews, that somehow or other Jews are excluded from this sacred circle, as I called it in the book, of minorities and who we have to care about and who we have to worry about because they're vulnerable. Jews are somehow not vulnerable because of that. And this is a completely it's a racist idea, and it leads, which is really important, to a anger and rage and hatred at Jews. Because I think a lot of people, this is a weird thing, right? A lot of people who've read the book, non-Jews, have said to me, "Oh, I didn't realise it was offensive to think that Jews are rich." And I want to say to them, right, you do understand that historically that has led to Jews having their houses burned down. Right? It's not just, oh, great, we're rich. It's not just a sort of, nice idea that it's not true, and B, it creates envy and rage and anger and a sense that Jews have got this money in an ill-gotten way or whatever. Anyway, my point is, what I should have said yesterday is all that mythology can be summed up in the fact that they've named an unscrupulous billionaire Herschel Fink.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting because you wrote about this in your book, and you said someone who might think that it's fine to think Jews are rich. Like, it's people love rich people, except no, they don't. They envy and resent them.
Yeah. But I think it's really, really an important thing because that was sort of new to me. Not new, but it was sort of a surprise to me how many people wrote to me and just said I didn't realize it was offensive to think that Jews are rich. And offensive is a complicated word. I never use the word offensive, but what I mean is that people wrote to me and said, oh, I didn't realize it was a stereotypical trope.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize it was a negative stereotype because people in a simple way associate being rich with something good. Isn't that what we all want to be? And you think like, yeah, maybe, but just dig into it a bit further. And what you'll discover is historically that association, I mean, I just happened to be in York, right? I did a gig in York, and there was a massacre in York in 1160. 150 Jews were put into Clifford's Tower, and there was a mob outside, and they all committed suicide, right? Now, that started because one or two Jewish moneylenders, and remember, Jews were forced to be moneylenders. They weren't allowed to keep property. They weren't allowed to farm, whatever. But they were allowed to trade in money. One or two Jewish moneylenders, some noblemen decided they were too rich, those Jews. They didn't want to pay any more money to those Jews. So they started stirring up anti-Semitic hatred. And that led to 150 Jews committing suicide in Clifford's Tower. So that's what the stereotype that Jews are rich does. Yeah.
Well, it sort of brings me on to my next point because, obviously the book has received critical acclaim from the Jewish community. But what I'm really curious about is the reaction to the book from the people who it's actually about. Like, have you had many people say to you something like, I can't believe I used to say this and think these things? Or have you had many people double down and be like, I still think what I think?
I've had lots and lots of ordinary people, just people, nice, ordinary people, either write to me on Twitter or come up to me in the street, come up to me after gigs, and say, look, I'm kind of the person you're talking about. I'm a left-wing, person. I've always thought of myself as anti-racist. I try my best, but I read your book, and one person described it as, I realize now this is the racism that sneaks past you. That there are things, because it is true, to be fair to these people, anti-Semitism is an elusive racism. It exerts itself in, as we've been talking about, tropes and stereotypes and myths and things that might confuse people, like being rich. Being thought of as rich is not necessarily a good thing. These are slightly complex ideas. Yeah. And it's to do with Jews having this strange thing that only Jews have, which is, although racists will think of them as, insect-like and alien and liars and dirty and all the low-stakes stuff, they also think of them as controlling the world and powerful and privileged, and that's complicated for people to get their heads around. So people have done that. What I haven't had, I would say, is any sort of major league sort of woke player come out and endorse the book. No, I mean, loads of people have endorsed the book, but they're basically, lovely people: Stephen Fry, Caitlin Moran, Satnam Tangera, Richard Ayawadi. These are people, but they're sort of centrists, for want of a better word.
Sure. Well, I mean, look, since the release of your book, which was in February of 2021, anti-Semitism sort of shot up, both online and in real life, largely because of the conflict between Israel and Hamas in May. And there was also this new hashtag it was a scam, which refers to anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And that kind of gained traction again on the anniversary of the EHRC report. Have you sort of noticed a change at all? I mean, is it getting obviously better, worse, the same? What do you make of the current sort of landscape?
Well, there's a social media landscape, and then there's the rest of the landscape. Now, the social media, I'm someone, I've just done a show about social media, I think, and I'm on social media quite a lot. I think social media is very important, and I think it does drive a wider way of thinking. So, but does still need to be understood. Hashtag it was a scam, which is basically the rump of the Corbynite left, really still furious, still furious that Jeremy Corbyn wasn't elected in 2019, still blaming it on Jews, still blaming it on what they see as the anti-Semitism smear and all that stuff. I mean, that does trend on Twitter from time to time, but I don't believe that in the wider world anyone really thinks that. And in fact, I believe quite sort of optimistically, really, that one of the reasons that Corbyn wasn't elected is that out there in what you might call, the Labour heartlands or the British heartlands, people found his, the fact of anti-Semitism being associated with the Labour Party at that point in time, if nothing else, kind of distasteful, just kind of not very British. Yeah. And so I was all kind of heartened by that, really. However, I think it still completely exists. You still get this thing, which I do talk about in the book, as far as the Labour Party, which is Keir Starmer trying to sort that out, is seen as nothing to do with Jews, really. It's just seen as a factional thing. It's just seen, this is a purge of the left, this is the right trying to take over. The fact they've suspended Corbyn is clearly a factional. And no one from the left even stops to say, oh, well, maybe he's trying to make Jews feel better about, rejoining the Labour Party or, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. They don't even bother to say that. It's just instantly a reflex feeling about that. As regards the Israel thing, no, that's clearly a thing that happens with regularity. Is that as soon as there's an Israel-Gaza, Israel-Palestine incursion, anti-Semitism starts to go off the charts. And as you know, I choose in the book not to talk very much about Israel, which is a very specific move I'm making. It's an intellectual move I'm making, which is that I don't feel it's incumbent upon me, as someone who wants to talk about anti-Semitism, to get bogged down talking about Israel. Sure. That's what happens. That's what the left does. The left says, what about Israel? Whether you want to say anything about being Jewish, they say, what about Israel? And my point is, what about Israel? I'm not Israeli. I'm a British Jew. I feel very little connection with that country. I feel no more connection with that country really than anywhere else where there's bad stuff happening in the world. And it is racist of you to say, what about Israel? And so that's why I don't spend much time talking about it. Having said that, there is in the American edition, there is a chapter which was written during the last sort of outbreak. And obviously, I do worry, if I want to talk about anti-Semitism, I do worry about the fact that when those things happen, you see types of anti-Semitism that are clearly nothing to do with the Middle East being resurgent in the wave of something happening in the Middle East. Yeah. So, for example, I used this example of how at a Gaza rally, someone was holding a placard that said, don't let them do it again. And it had a picture of Jesus on the cross on it. Right, or Jesus carrying a cross or whatever. And I think, well, that's not about Israel, is it? Because that happened in 33 AD and Benjamin Netanyahu wasn't there. So that's an ancient form of Jewish stereotyping. And that's what I always think with anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I hate the discussion of like, oh, is it anti-Semitic? Is it anti-Zionism? I kind of hate it. I'm sort of not interested. But if you want me to pin me down on what makes something anti-Semitic as opposed to anti-Zionist, it's if it contains a trope that existed long before the State of Israel. Yeah. So if you can spot an anti-Semitic trope that someone might have said in 1933 or 1160, like Jesus on the cross, that's the Jews' fault, then clearly something is wrong there. Clearly you're invoking something that is nothing to do with the politics of that place.
You mentioned that your book has recently come out in America. Have you noticed a difference in the response to your book between Brits and Americans?
Yeah, it's much less noticed in America. I mean, actually, something happened, which is there's a Jews don't countiness there as well. So because America obviously has a much bigger Jewish community, and I would like the book to get some spotlight in America because that would be 5 million people might buy it as opposed to 300,000 or whatever it is in Britain, right? So purely shallow reasons, I would quite like that. But because the Jewish community they don't have something, which is the Corbyn thing did activate and mobilise the Jewish community, and anti-Semitism was in the headlines. It was a live issue in British politics, which was kind of frightening, but in a way that it just hasn't been, certainly since the war. And I think that meant the book was very timely, and there's not quite a thing like that to focus on in America. But what there is in America, I would say, is a stronger woke culture which ignores Jews. So to give you a straightforward example of that, I was Jonathan Safran Foer, who is a Jewish writer. He introduced me to someone at the New York Times who was interested in me writing an op-ed about the book, writing a little piece about the book and blah, blah, blah. And it was all going really well. And she loved what I wrote and it was all fine. And then suddenly I got a message saying, oh, we're not doing this. And it was never really explained why. And the sense I got was, this isn't really what we want to focus on right now, right? Meaning there are other minorities, other issues, other battles that we need to fight. And the Jewish one just, it's just not on the table. It's not very cool, I think, is part of it.
Yeah.
It's not very cool. It's like anti-Semitism feels like an old deal. It's like, isn't that what your parents were worried about or whatever? I think for young people to get behind being a Jewish ally, this is something Sarah Silverman said. Sarah Silverman, she's a big fan of the book and has been brilliant about it and talked about it on her podcast or whatever. But she said to me, she's a very, very activist person and has said, I'm a black ally, I'm a gay ally, I'm a trans ally, but where are the Jewish allies? And that's even the word. You think like, I just know that's not a thing.
That's not a thing at all.
That's not a thing, being a Jewish ally. Yeah.
No.
And in a way that the fact that's not a thing is at the heart of what Jews Don't Count is about. Because the notion of allyship is stronger people who've got a sense of injustice, social justice. They want to ally themselves with groups they feel are put upon and weak and, not have a problem with power.
Yeah.
Disempowered, disenfranchised. The idea of allying with a group who somehow or other don't feel like that, you have to ask yourself, well, why? Why do you think Jews are powered, are empowered, are franchised, are okay, whatever? And, it's not to say that some Jews are that, right? But historically, that has not protected, that sense that that's what Jews are has not protected them from persecution. Yeah. And that's being massively ignored by the progressives. Things are much more politicized now than they ever were. And that is to do with social media.
Yeah.
And I would say it seems to be the case. And I sort of touched on this earlier when I talked about Keir Starmer and the way that the left see his actions in trying to protect the Jewish community. It's now the case that, and this is very awful and insidious, that being concerned about anti-Semitism feels to the left like it's the province of the right. Yeah?
Yeah.
It's like something that I've noticed more and more, that if you talk about anti-Semitism, there'll be a sense in which, oh yeah, this is something that, the Tories bring up, or this is something that, the free speechers bring up or whatever. It's like in the stupid stay in your lane, woke versus anti-woke culture war politics, I've noticed concern about anti-Semitism becoming something, as far as the woke people are concerned, that the left, that the right care about. It's a right-wing thing, isn't it? It's, because of Israel and sort of Trump being pro-Israel and everyone getting confused about that. And that is very mad, because what we're talking about here, at the end of the day, is a very deeply embedded form of racism that the left and the progressives should be absolutely on board with calling out and being concerned about. But it's got blurred in a way that is not useful for anyone who wants to raise anti-Semitism as a live issue for people who are concerned about that stuff.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to sort of wrap it up. But before we do, do you have anything you'd like to plug? The best bits of the interview.
Obviously, I think we've plugged Jews Don't Count, so do go and buy it. I write children's books, and I've written a book called The Boy Who Got Accidentally Famous. Here it is, if anyone's actually watching this. There, so lovely for Hanukkah. For your 8 to 12-year-old children. It's about a boy who thinks he's very dull and has got low self-esteem, and then a documentary crew come to his school and he becomes super famous. It's funny. So there's that. That's about it, really. I'm going to America to do, well, at the moment I am. These things shift very quickly, but I'm going to do Seth Meyers' show.
Brilliant.
And to talk about Jews Don't Count.
No way.
God knows how that's going to work on a late night comedy chat show. But there's a producer there who is obsessed with the book.
Wow.
And brilliantly thinks it's really important, which is great. And so I'm supposed to be going on that, but I don't know if I should plug it. And I have got a documentary. I'm probably going to be doing next year a Jews Don't Count documentary for Channel 4. But for BBC Two, I've already done a documentary called Anger, Social Media and Us, which is about what social media is doing to us in general. It's a sort of think piece about the rage, the sort of rage and madness and craziness that we all just accept as normalised now because of social media. And that's coming out on BBC Two on the 13th of December.
Well, that's very exciting. Well, David Baddiel, thank you very much for joining us for this interview.
Thank you, Eli. Ellie.
Ellie.
I called you Eli.
That's Ellie, most people do. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. All right. Cheers. Nice to see you.